A few weeks ago, I recreated one of my science fair projects from when I was a kid. I recreated my 3rd grade science fair project, which was testing different paper airplanes to see which one would go the furthest. The project was meant to study lift, and after that project, I think it's pretty safe to say that my projects afterwards tanked and having some sort of interesting scientific theory that I was testing in the background. Afterwards, it was mostly just whatever I thought was cool. And then, of course, by the time I hit 8th grade, I was kind of like, I like science, sure, but also I don't want to try too hard. And also around 8th grade was when I first started collecting playing cards. This is my box of playing cards, and it's not even all of them, it's just all the ones that fit in this box. I have a lot of different playing cards, and around 8th grade, when I started collecting them, I also decided my science fair project was going to be based around these playing cards. Obviously, there's not a lot of science projects you can do based around playing cards, so what I decided to do was to try 5 different methods of shuffling cards to see which method would get them the most shuffled up, or the most random. Randomness is a really hard thing to measure and quantify, especially since the human mind is really good at identifying patterns even when you don't mean to. Most people don't even recognize that their brain is recognizing all these patterns. When the iPod first came out, one of the things that was very revolutionary about it was the fact that it could shuffle songs. It would put all the songs in a random order, as opposed to cassette tapes or CDs that would just play them in a specific order, and it would always be that same order. Something interesting that happened though is that customers were complaining that the shuffle feature wasn't random. Of course, it was. Even when things are random, there are going to be some things that are in order. You might get 5 Beatles songs in a row, but that's still random. There's still a random chance that 5 Beatles songs could show up in a row. But because the customers were recognizing these patterns almost subconsciously, they felt like the iPod was not actually shuffling and was not as random as it should be. Because of this unconscious pattern recognition that goes on in our brain, they actually adjusted the shuffle feature to not be truly random. Because even when things are truly random, your brain is going to pick up on any patterns that come up. So instead of having it actually truly random, because even in true randomness, sometimes it feels like there's an order to it, the shuffle feature would take that randomness and purposefully make it more spaced out and less of a pattern. So while in true randomness you could get 5 Beatles songs in a row, the shuffle feature would now look at that and be like, that's too much in a row, that's too much of a pattern, and basically split them up. So it was no longer truly random, but it felt more random. All of that to lead into, when I'm shuffling these cards, true randomness isn't exactly what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is the least amount of patterns. For example, we don't want a bunch of diamonds in a row, and we definitely don't want a bunch of numbers in order. If I just dealt you a hand, I wouldn't want you to get a flush, you know? Back when I did this in 8th grade, I had 5 different methods of shuffling. I had the regular bridge shuffle, which I always just called regular because I don't know if it's actually called the bridge shuffle. I had the 3-pile shuffle. This is a shuffle that my little siblings who didn't understand how to do the regular shuffle would use. Another type of shuffling is when you take the deck and you just take chunks out and split it and shuffle it that way. This is how I shuffle my tarot cards, so I just labeled this one as tarot. I've heard it called different things like the split or chunking or basically anything. I don't know the exact name for this one, but I just called it tarot because this is how I shuffle all my tarot cards. Another type of shuffling I tested is something I called 52 card pickup. And if you have older siblings, you know what this game is. Basically, you throw all the cards, usually on the ground, and usually it's very messy, but because this is a science experiment, it was not that. But you throw all the cards in a pile and mix them up with your hands and then put them back together. When I was in 8th grade, my 5th type of shuffling was actually an automatic card shuffler that my parents had. I don't have one of those. Instead, I found something called the Hindu Shuffle. I'm not sure if that's the actual name or not. I've never heard of this before, but it's very similar to the Tarot Shuffle. The thing is, you shuffle these cards vertically instead of horizontally. Because of the direction I was pulling the cards, I was definitely not used to it, and I was having trouble pulling small chunks. They just always had to be in these big chunks. And so I can't tell if this shuffling suffered because of my lack of skill or because this style of shuffling is just not very good. But we'll see in our end results. So the first step in this process is actually making sure the cards are all in order to begin with. There has to be a baseline that we can compare our variations to. So I took the time to organize the cards. I organized them by number and then by suit. So ace through king in that order, ace, 2, 3, so on. And then I always organized them spade, heart, club, and diamond. After I was sure they were all in order, I shuffled. I did each shuffling technique 5 times. When I was in 8th grade, I shuffled them all 3 times, but I went with 5 this time because specifically with the Hindu style, I was having a lot of trouble getting used to it, so I wanted to give it a fair chance. Starting out with the standard form of shuffling, which could also count as our control. Because I liked playing cards so much around this time, I also learned how to shuffle really fast, I learned how to shuffle really well, and I shuffled all the fucking time. So I picked up a few tricks from shuffling all the fucking time. For example, I'm really good about splitting the deck perfectly in half. You can see because I have the ace of spades on one side and the ace of clubs on the other, that is a perfect split down the middle. Another thing I like to do to show off my shuffling skills is not shuffling on a table. I don't know how to explain it other than I can shuffle in midair. My hands don't have to be balanced on anything. I'm not like a card shark or anything. I tried to get into Magic and do like palming cards and all that fancy stuff. My hands are just too small. So this is really the most interesting things I can do with a deck of cards. Except for some like Magic that's based in math, which nobody wants to see anyway because nobody likes math. Interestingly with this one, the results were not that great. The first 4 cards were all spades, and the first 3 cards were not only in order, but also the first ones that were in the deck originally, so they never moved from that spot. However, throughout the rest of the deck, the cards are fairly random. There are a lot of double suits right next to each other, but that's hard to not have happen, and you would almost have to force the deck or manually do that to make it that not the case. There are not a lot of numbers in order, and I think it's clear to see why this is most people's preferred way of shuffling. It does a very good job of mixing the cards up randomly, and I think besides the first 4 cards, which probably was user error, it's very clear that this is a great way to get the cards in the most random order possible. Our next style of shuffling was then the 3 piles, or basically the way a lot of people learn how to shuffle before they know how to do the standard bridge. This entails taking your cards and splitting them into 3 piles in order as if you're dealing out the cards to players before stacking them back up and doing it again. I've seen variations where you take each of your piles and then split them into 3 before restacking them, but this shuffling technique already takes a long time, so I wanted to keep the time shuffling as short as possible. So instead I just split the deck into 3 piles 5 times, and that was our shuffle. When I did this project in 8th grade, since I only shuffled it 3 times, it was not very thorough. However, I think adding that 4th and 5th time really made a difference. We do have quite a few of the same suits together, and we do have quite a few of either the same number, so like these 2 13s here, or numbers in order, 11, 12, 9, 10, that sort of thing, 1, 2. So it's probably not the best way to shuffle, but I think doing more repetitions of it makes it more mixed, and also since our mind is predispositioned to see patterns, that is also working against it. The next shuffling style is the tarot style. I did this very simply cutting the deck repeatedly and shuffling it back into my hand. There are variations where you shuffle to the front, then the back, then the middle, like that over and over again, which probably would have made a bigger difference and gotten them more mixed up. Again, however, I wanted to keep these shuffles simple, so I just did a standard take a chunk and put it back, take a chunk, put it back, take a chunk, put it back. Of course, I did this 5 times, and then we were finally able to see our results. They were not good. Because in the shuffling style, you're taking chunks and putting them back in the same order, it's really hard to break up those chunks, especially with only 5 shuffles. For tarot cards, this isn't that big of a deal, especially with the way I read tarot, where I take whichever card falls out of the deck. As you can see when I'm shuffling these regular cards, cards are still falling out of the deck because of the way I shuffle these cards. So the order of the cards itself does not make that big of a difference in tarot. With playing cards, it does matter. And because it's just chunk after chunk after chunk without being able to split up this chunk, you get a lot of grouping of the same kinds of cards. For example, there was a 10 through the king of clubs right in a row, immediately followed by the 9 through the jack of diamonds, followed by the ace through the 4 of diamonds. So 7 diamonds in a row, mostly in order. And the rest of the deck is very similar. large chunks of the same suit, mostly in order. The biggest chunk of the same suit is the last 7 cards. They're all spades. They're not in order. We have 5 through 7, the queen, then the jack, then 8 and 9. So it's not exactly in order, but they're pretty close and they're all spades. So really not the best. If you want to use this method for shuffling playing cards, I would suggest going front, back, middle, or some variation of that. Or just don't use this one, use the bridge version instead. Now we can move on to our 52 card pickup style of shuffling. In 8th grade, my hypothesis was that this would be the worst version of the shuffle. And my hypothesis was based on the fact that I assumed that when you threw them all in a pile, the cards in the top would stay on the top and the cards on the bottom would stay on the bottom, just to the nature of how you were moving the cards. I was wrong in 8th grade, and the data back then proved me wrong, and I will show you the data now, which is very similar to how it was back then. We do have quite a bit of suits next to each other, but as mentioned before, that just tends to happen because there are 13 cards per suit and only 4 suits. So you literally have a fourth of the deck most likely going to be next to each other. That being said, however, very few of these are in number order. There are only 2 instances in this deck when cards of the same suit are also in number order, and it's only 2 cards then. It's not more than 2. So this actually is a fairly good way to randomize your cards. That is, if you actually take your hands and mess them around. If you just drop the cards in a pile and pick them back up, I don't think they would be that mixed up, for the reasons I was mentioning earlier. Whatever was on the bottom is probably going to stay on the bottom, and whatever was on the top is probably going to stay on the top. But if you take your hands and get in there and like really mix them up, then I think this is a pretty effective way to shuffle the cards. I think these would actually be close to, if not better, than the bridge style. Especially if you're bad at regular bridge shuffling. If you're not good at doing the regular style of shuffling, instead of doing the 3-pile shuffle or the split shuffle like we were talking about earlier, this could be a very effective way of shuffling cards. People probably wouldn't like that you're shuffling the cards like this, just like in a game. It is very clearly still a good way to get the cards mixed up. So our last style of shuffling is the Hindu style, which is going to be replacing the automatic machine that I had when I was in my parents' house. This was awful. This was terrible. The only way cards actually got mixed up was when I accidentally dropped cards and had to stick them in randomly. If the King of Clubs had not fallen out of the deck, the first 8 cards would all be diamonds in order, followed by more diamonds in order, the 4 of Clubs through the Queen of Clubs in order. Basically, there's hardly any variation in this at all. It's cards in order in the same suit. This could very easily be user error, because like I said earlier, I was having a really hard time figuring out the shuffle in the first place. And this is also very similar to the tarot style of shuffle, which we already saw earlier was not that great. The biggest difference between the tarot style of shuffle and this style of shuffle is this one specifically called for keeping them just straight like that, whereas in the tarot style, we can do the front, middle, back kind of variation. It seemed to be very specifically not doing any variation like that. Maybe I was picking up too big of chunks, I'm not really sure. But mostly nothing changed in this deck. It all stayed in order and it all stayed together in suits, and it would be a pretty terrible way of shuffling. So I already said earlier that randomness is pretty hard to quantify. However, I still want to try and declare a winner here, because otherwise what's the point? On the bottom, we're definitely going to have to put the Hindu style. It was tragically terrible. My own bad technique aside, I don't see how this could really shuffle the cards without pulling them individually almost, or without having some variation of how you put the cards back in the pile. Immediately above that is going to be the tarot style, without the variation of beginning, middle, end, or whatever variation you want to do, just taking in chunks and putting it back. It's very similar to the Hindu style, it's not great. The 3 piles one is not bad. I think it just takes a lot of time, and I think it's really easy for similar cards to be stuck next to each other, because it is a pattern each time. The way you are putting the cards down is a pattern. So obviously there's going to be some pattern in the way the cards line up because of that. I think the more you do it, the better it'll be. And also if you took those piles and then put them in random order, kind of like how you're talking about with the tarot shuffle, that would help tremendously. I'm going to go ahead and say the bridge shuffling is second best. It is very clearly very randomized. However, those first 4 cards are not great, and yes, this is probably my own fault that I shuffled them badly. But still, with the data we have, I do think the standard bridge shuffling is slightly worse than our winner, the 52 card pickup. I had the same results in 8th grade, and I was very surprised, especially since my hypothesis was that the 52 card pickup would be the worst. I think our data might have been a little bit tainted by the fact that I went in there and like really mixed them up, whereas if somebody just threw a pile of cards on the ground, they would just kind of stack them back up and pick them up. But the goal of this experiment was to shuffle the cards, so I made sure I went in there and mixed them up to try and get them as shuffled as possible. And I think that spreading them out and really making sure to get them mixed up went a long way into making sure they were mixed up, of course. I do think it's slightly better than the bridge version. If your cards are sticky or stiff, sometimes in the bridge version they can get stuck together, and then you're stuck with cards of the same suit in order next to each other. With just throwing them on the ground and mixing up, it's way easier to separate cards that were together in the beginning and put them in a brand new place. It's really fast to get a card that was on the bottom to the top of the deck, or from the middle to the bottom, vice versa. With the bridge shuffle, or the 3-pile shuffle, or the tarot shuffle, or most of these shuffles, you have to go through a few rounds in order to get a card from the bottom of the deck all the way up to the top. And you can do that with the first shuffle in the 52 card pickup. I feel like because every other style of shuffle had some sort of pattern or technique to it, it's harder to truly randomize the cards. If you do a perfect bridge shuffle one time, you're gonna get a bunch of pairs in a row. They won't be the same suit, obviously, but you'll get king, king, queen, queen, jack, jack, just like that, because of the technique. Since the 52 card pickup is truly randomized, I feel like that's what lends itself to having a more randomized outcome. The technique itself is much more random. Like I said, when I did this for the first time in 8th grade, this was definitely not the outcome I was expecting. My hypothesis was the bridge would be the best, not the machine, because I figured you needed some human error in there to make it more randomized. But in 8th grade, I did hypothesize that the 52 card pickup would be the worst. I got basically the same results here that I did in 8th grade, which means that this project is repeatable, and because my data was very similar as to what it was in 8th grade, it lends more credence to the results, and I would love for other people to try this experiment. You can totally steal this experiment if you can't think of a science project you want to do in school. I will say though, you need to pick a better title for your project, because they always make you come up with some kind of punny title. Party Rock Anthem came out like right before I had to do this project, and instead of going with the obvious Everyday I'm Shuffling, which would have been a banger of a title, I went with All Mixed Up. I will never forgive myself, and I am incredibly disappointed. That's going to be the end of this experiment today, however. I hope you had a fun time recreating this science fair project with me. I got to play with some cards, which is always fun, got to shuffle cards, which is always fun. I will not be offended if you steal the science fair project and claim it to be your own. I hope you all had a fun time watching, and I will see you all in the next one.